Thank you very much, Vikram, and I would like to thank you and Mr. Gandhi for inviting me to Manthan. Manthan, of course, has a tremendous reputation as providing a platform for what you yourself said about, allowing a diversity of views, diversity of perspectives to be debated, to be argued through. So it is an immense privilege for me really to have this opportunity of being on this platform and also having an opportunity to really interact with very distinguished set of people. So thank you once again. Um, so what I wanted to focus attention on was, here is uh, a pandemic, which is whichever dimension of this pandemic you look at, is changing the way we live, the way we work, and soon it will be the way we think. Uh, it is one of those defining moments in history. So if you are aware of a Oxford historian, Margaret Macmillan, who has written about the First World War and how that was a certain defining moment in history. So she has said that like France in 1789 or Russia in 1917 or Europe during the years leading up to the Second World War. Uh, these are all junctures in history where she says the river of history changes direction. So, in a sense, we are at such a juncture where the river of history, quite visibly in front of us, is changing direction. Now, if that is the case, what will be the nature of the geopolitical landscape that might emerge from this very major transformation that is taking place all around us. So it is not the pandemic itself in a sense, but what is uh, it's the kind of changes that it is leaving in its wake or will leave in its wake. So I would like to make two propositions. One is that there were very major changes which were already taking place even before the pandemic came. And these were very significant changes. Uh, so what has pandemic done with respect to those changes? Um, and second is, uh, since the pandemic, what are the likely changes that are going to take place? So one is that the pandemic has actually accelerated some of the changes which were already taking place before this event. Uh, but there may be some new elements which have also been introduced into the equation. So I think what we have to recognize is that the power equations in the world were already changing. So we had this shift in the center of the global economy from the Atlantic to the Trans-Pacific. That is the domination of Northern America, Western Europe over the international system in all its various aspects. That is going into relative decline, and the salience of Trans-Pacific, in particular, the emergence of major powers like China, but not only China. There is a whole cluster of powers which are emerging and which are becoming ascendant in the Asian landscape. So this particular shift was already taking place before. If you recall, there was another very major event which took place, which is the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008. Now, before that, there was, in a sense, a certain unipolar moment where at the end of the Cold War, you had a hyperpower like the United States of America, essentially dominating the geopolitical landscape. What 2007, 2008 did was to bring that unipolar moment to an end. And since then, what we have been seeing is that the gap in the national capabilities, in the power of China and the power of the United States, that gap is now shrinking. The United States of America still remains a formidable economic as well as military power, perhaps more of a military power rather than economic power. But China has been steadily reducing that particular gap. What the pandemic is going to do is to accelerate that. That is the asymmetry which we had seen between China and the United States earlier, that shrank as a result of the global economic and financial crisis. And what the pandemic is doing is to shrink it even further. Why? Because China, as you have seen, irony that even though the pandemic first erupted in China, it is China which has managed to control it most successfully. And if you see the economic recovery trends, it is China which has recovered amongst the major economies. Its economy has recovered much faster than others. No doubt about that. So that particular trend of reduced asymmetry, reduced power gap between China and the United States as the two leading powers in the world, that gap is shrinking faster than may have been anticipated before. So that is one particular trend that we need to look at. Now, corollary to that is, what about India? What has changed about India? Now, reference was made to my role in the negotiation of the Indo-US nuclear deal, which the negotiations began in 2005 and concluded in 2008. Now, I want to explain to you that there was a certain geopolitical landscape which made it possible for us to actually successfully conclude such a landmark agreement. No doubt that this was a very major event in India's diplomatic history. So what made that possible? So here I want to just focus attention on the asymmetry of power between India and China. What was different from 2003 to 2007 was that even though there was a gap in the capabilities of India and China, both in economic terms as well as in military terms, the difference was that India was seen, because it was growing at the rate of about 8 to 9% per annum, it was seen as reducing that gap. India, if you recall, at that time was even being touted as the next China, as the next great commercial opportunity in the global economy. India's, for example, performance in the just after the tsunami hit, the Indian Navy was one of the first, in fact, to go and deliver, supplies, relief supplies, assistance to a whole lot of countries in Southeast Asia, even though India itself was impacted by the tsunami. And that had a major impact in perceptions of countries around the world. That perhaps we had not realized that here is a country which not only is growing at this very rapid rate, but also has these very substantial, significant military capabilities. So even though there was a gap, power gap between India and China, the difference was that India was seen as reducing that gap, and that is what created the geopolitical sort of canvas against which India's own profile started increasing. And that is what, to my mind, that is what made it possible for us to actually conclude something major like the Indo-US nuclear deal. Even with China, 2005, when I was Foreign Secretary, Chinese Prime Minister came to Delhi on a visit. That was the occasion where we were able to actually conclude what is known as the political parameters and guiding principles for settling the India-China border issue. Again, a very significant document because it really set out very concrete principles on which we should be seeking a border settlement. And that was also the time, if you recall, that for the first time the Chinese produced maps which showed Sikkim as a integral part of India, which they had been resisting. So if you see India's diplomatic equations at that time, you will see that actually these expanded quite significantly. So in a sense, I was very fortunate to be foreign secretary at a time where India's profile, as I said, was increasing, and we were able to translate that into some significant gains for India. What is different today? What is different is that, just as I mentioned, that 2007, 2008 was in a sense, a kind of a turning point in the equation between the US and China, it also became a turning point in India-China relations. Because from growing at a rate of 8 to 9% per annum before this, thanks to the global financial and economic crisis and some structural issues in terms of our own economic reforms, there has been a trend of India's growth rate actually diminishing. So today, if a trend rate of 6% to 7% is achieved by India or anticipated, people say that would be great. Very rarely are people talking about India's capability, which I think it's still there, of growing actually at the rate of double digits, 10% per annum. That capability is there, that potential is there. But our prospects have diminished. What about China? Not only did China make a quick recovery from the global financial and economic crisis, but in fact, it was able to maintain a growth rate of 6% to 6.5% per annum since then, which relatively speaking was one of the fastest among the major economies. So what has that resulted in? Resulted in China reminding us day in and day out, our friends, Indian friends, should realize that China is 5 times the size of the Indian economy. So that is the asymmetry that we have ended up with. So one is what is happening in the global scale with regard to the emergence of China's power. The other is what is happening to India's relative position, because there should be no doubt that if there is one country which has the maximum impact, the greatest impact on India's geopolitical situation, it is China, and will remain for quite some time to come. So this is why I say that at the heart of India's geopolitical dilemma is how do we deal with this kind of situation that we are facing. This is really at the heart of the problem. Now, when we are talking about the pandemic, as I have pointed out, that China once again has demonstrated that it has the ability to marshal all its national capabilities in order not only to deal with this pandemic very successfully, at least so far, but also bring about a very major economic recovery. It ended the last year, the pandemic year, as the only major economy which had a positive rate of growth. That is 2% or 2.5%. I mean, there are some maybe differences in terms of the exact figure. Now, if you see the latest Chinese National People's Congress, which was held just a few weeks ago, this year, China expects to grow above 6%, but the general expectation is 6.8%. Now, you will agree that in the current situation, a major economy, the second largest economy of the world, growing at 6.8% per annum is a very, very, very remarkable development in a sense. It is not very clear what will India's growth rate be. We have already suffered a contraction. in the pandemic year, 2020. The prospects for the current year, perhaps since we will be starting from a low base, we will be growing at a much faster rate. But in terms of the asymmetry that we are talking about, I'm afraid that asymmetry is going to expand rather than diminish. So that is the other aspect that we have to perhaps take into account. Now, let us see how do we then what is the correct assessment to make about these larger trends that I spoke about, and how do we position India to take advantage of this situation rather than be overwhelmed by it. That is basically what I see as our challenge. So let me first, make a proposition which is perhaps controversial. Despite what we see happening around us, there is a stalling of globalization. There is a backlash, in fact, against globalization. We are seeing, that more narrow nationalist, trends are visible across the world, including in India itself. You see, as a result of these changes taking place, the natural reaction is to down the hatches and protect yourself behind the walls that you raise. There is a certain kind of a return to, not entirely, but some, shall I say, a tendency to go back to autarkic kind of situation. So this is what is perhaps visible, and some people are saying we are now entering a age of deglobalization. I contest that. My view is that globalization is here to stay. Why do I say that? Because globalization is a creature of technological advancement. As long as technology continues to advance, and at even more rapid pace than what we have witnessed in the past, globalization is going to, if maybe it is stalled for the time being, but it is going to come back, in fact, with greater force. So that is, to me, that is a given trend. Now, why do I also, in a certain sense, are you going to give up your access to internet? Are you going to put away your smartphones? No, you're not going to do that. That has become so much a fabric of our lives that I cannot see people, in fact, going back, regressing back to a different kind of society, different kind of community. So to me, the good assessment to make as a country is that globalization is here to stay. And therefore, what does that mean? That countries which are going to stay ahead of the globalization curve are going to be the winners of the future. So this is something which we have to recognize. Now, that also means, therefore, that you have to make a conscious, deliberate effort to resist the kind of pressures to, put tariff walls around yourself, let us get out of free trade agreements, let's not join the RCEP, we must, or at least a narrower interpretation of Atmanirbhar Bharat. This is not what is required in order to position India to really take advantage of the major sort of, changes that are taking place. So pandemic may have brought about a certain kind of stalling, and in some cases even, perhaps even some reversal. But I believe that this can only be temporary, because the forces which are actually pushing globalization, those forces are in fact getting stronger, not getting weaker. Now, as we like what we are doing today on a digital platform, There is actually, because of the pandemic, there is galloping globalization taking place. That I think everyone will agree that thanks to the pandemic and thanks to the kind of limitations on physical movement, we are seeing an explosion in terms of the digital economy. So that is also a feature of globalization. So this is the first proposition I would like to make. The second is that if we are looking at how we position India in the changing landscape, to me, there is no doubt that the most important space for us is our neighborhood. If you cannot get your neighborhood right, you will not be able to play a very credible role regionally and a credible role globally. Because if there is a crisis situation all the time erupting in your neighborhood, you will always be pulled back to their neighborhood. The second thing is to realize that whatever aspirations we have for regional economic integration with the dynamic countries of Southeast Asia, of East Asia, or even with the global economy, we should actually be looking at our South Asian neighborhood, the subcontinent, as the platform on which we seek that larger integration. So the way to look at our future is concentric circles of cooperation which we develop, with the innermost circle being actually the neighborhood. Now, here we have to understand that what is our challenge in the neighborhood. Challenge in the neighborhood is that even though the subcontinent is a single geopolitical, geo-economic space, it is also a space which enjoys great cultural affinity, a shared history. But the reality is that this space is actually fragmented into several independent sovereign countries. Now, our challenge lies in how we overcome these national divisions to at least be able to collaborate on dealing with and in advancing our own economic interests. So there, asymmetry actually is an advantage for India, is an asset for India. What does asymmetry do currently? That it generates all kinds of anxieties amongst our neighbors, because they see this very large dominating country whose capabilities, whether in economic terms or in terms of its military strength, is more than all the neighbors put together. So it should come as no surprise that there is a certain kind of fear of domination amongst our neighbors. And we have to try and overcome that. The way to deal with the neighborhood is to really see whether this asymmetry, which in some sense is a negative factor, can it be turned into a positive factor? And I believe it can be. Because as the largest economy in the region, even if you were to open out your market to everything that your neighbors are able to sell to you, it would still be a small fraction of the Indian market. Or if you position yourself, for example, as the transit country of choice for all your neighbors, because you have borders with all your neighbors, they don't have borders with each other. So you are a natural transit country for the neighbors. Now, can you bring yourself to accepting that I will give what I call, say, national treatment to all my neighbors? That is, you can use our transport infrastructure the way you want, whichever railway line you want to send your goods on, whichever port you want to use. Make India the country of choice, the economic partner of choice in the pursuit of development by our neighbors. You become the engine of growth for your entire neighborhood because you have the capability to do that. But if you start retreating back, as I said, into a kind of a national, sort of a kind of a shelter that, everything outside our borders is hostile and we must protect ourselves, then you are going to have a problem. So connectivity, not only physical connectivity through highways, railroads, digital connectivity, but connectivity also what I call the software of connectivity. That is, no point in having a glass top highway across the border if trucks still have to wait for 2 days or 3 days to be able to make the crossing, which is what mostly happens on our borders. So this is the second proposition that I would make, that it is very important that we get the neighborhood right. And today it is much more challenging. Why? Because the same power that we are talking about, which is going to be our major, challenge going forward, is actually penetrating into this neighborhood. And I have always said, if you leave open spaces, somebody is going to come and occupy them, which is what, in a sense, has been happening. So even if we are saying neighborhood first, that neighborhood first has to be translated into actual policies on the ground in terms of, what are the kind of resources we are able to deploy in terms of, bringing about that integration. How much of political engagement are we able to, in fact, bring about? Not only at the level of maybe just the leaders, not only at the bureaucratic level, but at every level. And here, the fact that you have those very strong cultural affinities that I spoke about, that shared history that we spoke about, that is a great advantage. The kind of cultural affinity that you enjoy, for example, with Nepal, no matter how much China tries, it cannot have that. So look at the assets which you have, which others don't have, and try to leverage them. So that is the second proposition that I would like to make. Now, the third proposition is that, if I'm looking at what is the nature of interstate relations in this new era, and it's not just related to the pandemic, but pandemic is certainly an important element of it. Um, the salience of what I call cross-cutting issues, cross-national, global issues has been increasing day by day. This itself is a reflection of the globalization that I spoke about. So now there are a whole set of challenges which the world faces, which no country, no matter how powerful it is able to resolve on its own. So if you take, say, the issue that is becoming very, very important during this year, which is climate change. Climate change is a classic global challenge. That it is resulting from, of course, these carbon emissions which are being emitted and are gathering in the Earth's atmosphere and causing this global warming. But even if tomorrow we are supposed to be one of the major emitters, supposing tomorrow our emissions became zero by some miracle, would climate change stop? No, it won't. Because unless others join you in reducing their emissions, the global climate change will continue to take place. So this is why you require a global and collaborative response. Now, what is the pandemic showing? The pandemic is showing the same thing. The pandemic is a global public health challenge. And yet you see completely fragmented national self-defeating responses. Now we have a new term, vaccine nationalism. Now, it should be clear to everyone that unless the whole world, or at least majority of the population of the world, is being vaccinated and can resist the infection, nobody in the world is safe. So here is a classic global challenge which requires a global response. And if you don't have that global collaborative response, you end up with precisely the kind of situation which we are facing today. So this is my point, that the salience of global issues, cross-cutting issues, whether it is climate change, whether it is global, pandemics, whether it is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, whether it is international terrorism, whether it is, global crime, all these have now acquired a dimension which makes them not amenable to national solutions, not amenable to regional solutions. Only global collaborative solutions are possible. And who will deliver that? That can only be delivered through international institutions of governance. So unless there is a willingness to actually work through international institutions like the WHO, for example, the International Telecommunication Union, when it comes to, for example, communication networks. We have several of these international organizations to deal with these kind of global challenges, and yet what we are seeing is that these have become platform for national contestations rather than international collaboration. So this is the dilemma that we face, the other dilemma that we face, that the salience of global issues has increased and will keep on increasing. Why? Because globalization will continue. So if you're talking about cybersecurity, you cannot deal with it unless there are norms which all the important countries of the world are ready to adhere to. Space has become very important. You have thousands of satellites now orbiting the Earth's atmosphere. How do you make certain that they remain safe? How do you make certain that there is no crowding? All that requires international collaboration. So where should India place itself? So if India recognizes this trend, then it makes sense for India to actually position itself in some way as a lead country in terms of multilateralism. Because there is a crying need for that. There is a crying need for leadership in that space. So India has a great tradition of multilateralism. Thanks to our leaders in the post-independence period, India was one of the most important champions of the United Nations. India led the United Nations into very major, initiatives like the decolonization program. Many people do not know that the Declaration of Human Rights is actually in a very major, significant way an Indian contribution. People would be surprised to hear that both the United States and the then Soviet Union were opposing it for their own reasons. So actually, we played an important role because somebody like Mr. Nehru recognized even at that early stage that this new world that has come about as a result of the end of the Second World War is going to be a world where the salience of such issues is going to keep on increasing. And it makes sense for India to position itself as one of the champions of multilateralism, as one of the champions of the United Nations. Now, that requires tempering your nationalism, not giving up nationalism. That is a wrong notion. That if I support multilateralism, or if I support the United Nations structure, somehow it means that I'm eroding my national interest. That is not the case. Yes, of course, as diplomats, we all the time have to weigh national interests against the internationalism that is also required. But to think that internationalism per se is opposed to national interest is a wrong notion. So this is the third proposition that I make, that in terms of the global geopolitical landscape which is emerging, one, we are going to see a greater, in a sense, shift of the power center to our own region. So in one sense, it's a good thing. But that particular region, there will be a push by China as the ascendant power to put in place a more hierarchical order dominated by China itself. Our challenge is how to resist that so that there is a more multipolar kind of a system which actually emerges. And we have, as I said, a cluster of major powers in the region. You also have major powers like the United States, you have Japan, you have Australia, you have others who also are interested in making sure that there is not a hierarchical order dominated by China. So how do we work together with them in order to resist that? So the Quad is, in a sense, one particular feature of that particular strategy. How do we take this shift to Asia or acceleration of that shift to Asia as an opportunity for India rather than something which inevitably is going to be China dominated? That is the first one. Second is, how do we make certain that we get our neighborhood right? Because that will determine whether or not we are able to place ourselves in an advantageous location in this shifting terrain. And the third, as I said, is to make certain that multilateralism becomes an effective instrument for India to advance its interests. And all this ties up with what I said right in the beginning: globalization is here to stay. Much of what I'm talking about are actually reflections of that underlying reality. So that's my brief presentation on how I see the world changing around us, and how do I see the best way that India can position itself in this space. Because finally, I would like to say that when the international order is a frozen order, it is a stable order. Emerging countries like India would find it very difficult to, to try and create some space for themselves. It is only in a period of change, in a period of transformation, that spaces open up for countries like India, if we are perceptive enough, if we are far-sighted enough, to be able to actually locate ourselves in an advantageous position. Thank you very much for your attention.
This was absolutely wonderful, Mr. Shyam Saran. Manthan is fortunate that it has been able to get people of your expertise and depth and understanding and knowledge to come and share some amazing insights into the geopolitics of this world. This last 1 hour was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot. Thank you so very much. I'll share some questions that I have from the audience. Bikram and I will ask you these questions. Subodh Shinoy, a friend, is asking, can you comment on the recent agreement between China and Iran covering investments of USD 400 billion in exchange of 25 years of oil?
Yeah, well, let me first say that, I have tried to find some, tangible sort of evidence that such a deal has been actually concluded. But I must confess, I have not been able to. There has been talk of such a very ambitious kind of a agreement between the two countries. But there is very little available in terms of details. And it appears to me, on the face of it, that a country like Iran, which has a very strong sense of its own, shall I say, exceptionalism, as also a kind of a civilizational state, I would find it difficult to believe that it would tie itself down to this kind of a very long-term relationship with China. It would certainly want to take advantage of its relationship with Russia as well as China. to open up space for itself. But this appears to me still something which is in the realm of speculation. The current evidence I see is of Iran trying to see whether it can actually get back to some kind of a limited understanding with the new administration in Washington, with the Biden presidency. And I know that the current administration is very much focused on trying to get back to the Iran nuclear deal, and to have some kind of a working relationship with Iran. And as you see, there has also been some pressure on Saudi Arabia to retreat from its engagement in Yemen against Iran-backed rebels. So that is one sign. The other sign is that with respect to Afghanistan, which the US is quite desperate to really get out of, Iran will be a very important player in that. So I see that for various reasons, some opening has come about, which Iran may be able to exploit. So locking itself into this kind of a long-term relationship goes against that trend, which is why I am a little skeptical.
There's a question here, because you did mention that the gap between China and US is reducing between both economic and military power. Do you see that China will have more occasions to express its renewed military power? Will China go to war?
It's the decisions to go to war are very, very are not easy decisions which any country, even the most powerful country in the world, would make. The only issue on which there could be a possibility of a military clash, in my view, is the Taiwan issue. If there is a view that takes hold in China that the United States of America or some of the Western powers, Japan, are trying to promote independence by Taiwan, then the Chinese side over the last several years has developed enough military capabilities to actually carry out a major military operation against Taiwan. Now, in that kind of a situation, would the United States of America come to the aid of Taiwan? Not very clear. At this point of time, that is not very clear. But that is the only issue on which I think that there is a certain kind of unpredictability about the situation in the region. Other things being equal, I do not expect China to move against Taiwan militarily, as long as Taiwan does not declare any kind of independence. I would still not think that that is going to happen.
Your statement and call on globalization were absolutely bang on. How is the current Atmanirbhar movement internally within the country going to impact deal with globalization? Do you think it is significantly going back to the old times of inward-looking policies, or do you think kind of self-reliance which will be against global trade and business?
The government says that Atmanirbhar Bharat is not going to take us in the direction of, less globalization of the Indian economy. But then we have to see what happens on the ground.
Yeah.
So for the last 4 years, we have seen a consistent increase in our tariffs. So that is evidence which is going against what is being said. I myself was rather taken aback by the decision not to go ahead with the RCEP, because I also believe that you cannot hope to play a credible regional or a global role from the margins of the global or the regional economy. The economic pillar is absolutely essential in any kind of articulation of national interests or external interests that you have. So that to me also is taking us in a reverse direction. At bottom line is this: if Atmanirbhar Bharat takes us back to the period of a high cost, low quality economy, then what possibility do we have really to play a credible regional or international? That's not possible. So I would hope that in putting forward this Atmanirbhar Bharat policy, these contradictions are actually, first of all, we need through our discussions like this to really expose those contradictions. To give you another example, we want to be part and parcel of global supply chains. You can't be a part and parcel of global supply chains if you have a high tariff economy.
True enough.
How do you become part of such chains? So I think it is extremely important that we think through some of these issues. Yes, the focus on building up India's infrastructure. Yes, the focus on easing doing business in India, reducing bureaucratism. All that is certainly very, very worthwhile. But then it has to also be in consonance with some of these other issues that I'm talking about. And here I think there is a certain degree of confusion. I would end on a positive note by saying that I was happy to see that the Prime Minister in his last statement on Atmanirbhar Bharat said Atmanirbhar Bharat is an issue of national spirit. Not so much in terms of a more protected economy. So if it has finally dawned that this is not the way forward, I think we should welcome that.
There's one question here on can India give up its big brother attitude with its neighbors and win them over? India's law, of course, it has an adversarial position now with Pakistan, with Nepal. Our relationship with Bangladesh was, I think, not so encouraging. Sri Lanka, I think China is wooing them. Myanmar, I don't know where we are. Are we furthering an adversarial position instead of a cooperative position with our neighbors?
Well, as I mentioned when I spoke about the neighborhood first policy, that there is a lot that you need to do with regard to your neighborhood. But let me make, this is as a practitioner, as a person with some diplomatic experience, there is no way that you can avoid the sense of anxiety or fear that our neighbors have because of the overwhelming power of India vis-a-vis these countries. So that's a given. I think this constant fear that we are not liked in our neighborhood, that somehow nobody loves us. I think as a professional, I would I would put aside those sentiments. We are not in the business of trying to win affection in our interstate relations. What we are trying to do is to see what is the best way in advancing India's interests, while not in any sense undermining what also are the key interests of our neighbors. I mean, we should recognize just as we have very, vital interests, so do our neighbors. Now, the trick lies in how do you position yourself so that you are seen as helping your neighbors to advance what they regard as their vital interests. Not that will they now love us because we are doing something for them, or will they hate us because we are doing something else. That I do not take that into account. Not in interstate relations. There are any number of reasons why we should work on, for example, as I said, the cultural affinity between our countries, the fact that we have, as I said, a shared history. There are many things that unite us with our people in our neighboring countries. All that is fine. But at the end of the day, what is the kind of leverage that you have in influencing policy making in your neighboring countries? In what way do you become, as I said, an engine of growth for those countries to meet their development objectives? What is their vital interest? Vital interest at the end of the day is seeking development for their country. How relevant are you in that context? So if you take, for example, a success story to some extent is Bhutan. Bhutan is today, in per capita terms, the richest country in South Asia, thanks to the very strong interdependence which has been built up because of the hydroelectric power, projects that we have done there, and the fact that India is the market of choice for selling power. That gives a lot of leverage. The other cultural, etc., is icing on the cake, but that's not the cake. So I think we have to look at our relationship with our neighbors from that perspective. I'm not discounting that, our neighbors perhaps look at us as a big brother, or they see that we are trying to perhaps, undermine their independence. That is a given. I've seen that throughout my career. So I don't take that as something very important. But I think much more important is what is it that we do to develop that web of interdependence, that network of interdependence with our neighbors, so that we have a certain confluence of interest in working together. That is what is necessary, which is why I said, can we position ourselves as the engine of growth for our entire neighborhood, including Pakistan, by the way. This is something which is possible. But you need the right kind of policies. I'm afraid I don't see that very much. Some progress has been made, but there is still a long way to go.
Pakistan has been the biggest issue that we have had amongst the neighbors over the last few decades. Do you think it is ever going to be possible to make friends with Pakistan and work with Pakistan? Also considering the fact that it has its own compulsions internally, and so we seem to be having our own political compulsions internally. Given these considerations, do you think it's likely that we will ever become real good friends and work with Pakistan?
Well, again, I don't like describing interstate relations as a friend or enemy, because that, in a sense, obscures the reality of interstate relations and what should be your aim in those terms. So let me say that I certainly believe that it is possible for India and Pakistan to work out a relationship which may not be friendly in the terms that is being described, but which, in a sense, enables both countries to pursue what may be bigger objectives for themselves. And in that context, it is also important to realize, in terms of the challenges that I mentioned that we face, today, some of the challenges that are upon us as South Asian countries, if they were actually to come about because we did not take the right kind of action, much of the political issues that divide us will pale into insignificance. So take, for example, the climate change issue. South Asia, as I mentioned to you, is a integrated, one single geopolitical unit, geo-economic unit, shared history, as I said, shared, cultural affinity, but it is also an ecologically integrated space. So our, borders cannot divide rivers. We are looking at rivers, for example, as if there was some piece of private property which you can chop up into, different fragments. You cannot manage rivers in that fashion. They are not pieces of property. They are living systems. Or if you look at the Himalayan mountains, very fragile ecology. All of us, several of us share that ecology. And yet, if there is continued degradation, despoliation of this space, very fragile ecological space, all of us will suffer very badly. So melting of glaciers is a huge, huge problem. And it cannot be dealt with by, say, because we have the largest space of the Himalayas with India, we can deal with it. No, you cannot deal with it. Unless you have Nepal on board, unless you have Bhutan on board, unless you have Pakistan on board, and even in a larger sense, even if you would need to have even China on board. Only then is there any credible possibility of your being able to address that. So, are we, as the largest country in the region, perhaps more aware of these challenges and are therefore ready to take a certain leadership role in trying to manage our relationships in the neighborhood so that at least we create a platform on which these kind of challenges can be dealt with. So in that sense, it was good that Prime Minister Modi took, in a sense, advantage of the pandemic to reach out to the neighboring countries. How do we, it's a public health challenge, it does not recognize borders. Is there some way in which we can come together and deal with this pandemic? But, it was still quite hesitant. It could have been much more than what it is. And, we started off well by making available vaccines to our neighboring countries. But, I just heard a couple of days ago that we have put restrictions on the supply of vaccines even to our neighbors. Now, that's not a very, very good policy. So there are these ups and downs in terms of how we deal with the situation. But I would say that with respect to Pakistan, there are many reasons why, despite the hostility, despite some of the outstanding issues, there is much logic in our being able to work together on some really key and very, very defining issues that are confronting us. As I said, those issues will, when they emerge, what divides us today politically will seem to be rather insignificant.
So there's a good question here on the deal which you piloted on the nuclear deal. Looking back, almost 12 years since it has happened, or maybe a little more. Do you think that we have achieved where we are today is what you expected to be? Is the enthusiasm gone, or is there a change and shift? Because I think that a lot of work, including by you and the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, has been gone into in getting the deal through. But have we diluted any of those stands which we have? The
key achievement was that without having to in any way circumscribe our strategic program, we were able to get the resumption of international cooperation in nuclear energy. Now, in 2005, when I started the negotiations, at that time, many people do not realize that we were facing a very major issue of not being able to get nuclear fuel for our existing nuclear plants. We don't have enough uranium in the country. There is no reason why we should not, but the fact is that we did not develop those indigenous resources fast enough. So we have been very heavily dependent upon fuel imports. And once Russia joined the nuclear supplies group, then it was not in a position to make exceptions for India for the supply of nuclear fuel. So our nuclear power plants, for example, at Tarapur and a few others, were operating at very low capacity, and there was even a threat of their having to close down. Now, compared to that situation, today, thanks to the nuclear deal, you have multiple agreements with various countries for long-term supply of fuel. Canada, Australia, Namibia, Uzbekistan, Russia itself. So many countries, we have agreements so that if there is a major expansion which takes place of our nuclear industry, fuel will not be a constraint. And that's a very important gain from this. I'm limiting myself only to the nuclear side for the time being. The other very important change was that with respect to the access to technology, people should remember that in 1974, when India had the first so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, then the United States led a number of supplier countries, nuclear technology capable countries, to put a number of sanctions against India. But those initial sanctions were with respect to nuclear industry, our access to, say, nuclear fuel, our access to actual nuclear technology, these were stopped. What happened since 1974 was that a whole set of dual-use technologies, which may have had any kind of a remote connection with nuclear, also was proscribed. So a whole set of technology denial regimes were built around India. You remember the crazed supercomputer incident, where we wanted a supercomputer, which was one of the more advanced ones at that time, for better weather forecasting. But it was denied because they said it could also be used for nuclear calculations. So what we found ourselves completely hemmed in, that even some technology which may have very remote connection with nuclear, because it was said dual use, we could not have access to it. Or licensing procedures were so restrictive that it was very difficult to actually get access. Not only from the United States, but all those countries which were allied with the United States. For example, Germany did not have an export control list, but they had an informal white list. So, whole range of technologies which could not be shared with India. So, what did the nuclear deal do? Because all the technology denial regimes, in a sense, were at the end linked to the nuclear issue. Once the nuclear key was turned, as a result of the nuclear deal, these technology denial regimes then were dismantled. So we could not have reached a point where we have such easy access to high technology, not only from the United States, but from other countries also, thanks to the nuclear deal. So it was nothing linked to nuclear itself, but it was much larger issue. That was a huge gain for India, but not many people realize. Thirdly, despite not signing the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, you are the one country which has access to all the entire international commerce on nuclear. The diplomatic space that it has created for India, you are no longer an outsider, you are no longer a nuclear pariah, you are part and parcel of the entire nuclear order, in a sense, in the world. And that's a big diplomatic gain. So I would say that some of the advantages of the nuclear deal are underappreciated. And today we don't talk so much about it. That itself shows how much you are taking it for granted. That what you have been able to gain from this, it is now something that you accept without even thinking about it.
Correct.
The only place where we have not been able to gain very much is in terms of actually being able to get large-scale nuclear reactors into India, which was one of the objectives, and that has to do much more with the impact of the Fukushima disaster rather than the fault of the nuclear agreement in that sense.
Uh, a friend asks, why has India systematically failed to position itself as a major hub for research and the destination for investors? Even post the pandemic, there is a minuscule of shifts in investment away from China into India. Investments, after all, will only add global weight to India.
Well, this goes back to the question that we were looking at before, that on the one hand, we want to be part and parcel of global supply chains, but we do not follow policies which will actually enable that. The first inconsistency is precisely what I mentioned, that you cannot have high tariffs and yet want to be part of global supply chains. That is issue. Second is for inviting investment into India, fixed FDI into India. One of the major issues is infrastructure. And infrastructure in India has not really improved to the point where the ease of doing business in terms of being able to get materials from the port to the factory, from the factory to the port. This is logistics which still is quite poor, and therefore that needs to improve. The third issue is a very fundamental issue. If you look at the last 20 years or so, you would be amazed that the ease of doing business has been focused more and more on portfolio investment. So today, you can bring in billions of dollars of money into the Indian stock market, into the security market, but you also have the possibility of being able to take billions out in few hours if you wish to. So you have exposed yourself to considerable amount of volatility for the sake of getting these large-scale financial flows. I'm not saying that you should not get these flows, but I'm saying that you are also at the same time opening yourself up to some volatility. But on the other hand, if you look at FDI, which is actually persuading investors to come and build in India, to be here for the long term, to become part of the Indian growth story, that is not as easy as what you have in the FPI. Now, this doesn't make sense to me. You should actually be creating a situation where it is much more attractive for a foreign investor to come in and actually set up shop in India rather than bringing money and take it out. So this is something in terms of economic strategy we should be thinking about. How do we create that condition? And lastly, I would say it's very good that we are saying we want to attract foreign investment. We want India to become a platform for even an export market to other countries. Now here, what is very important is again to look at the inconsistency. Because if you are allowing foreign investment to come in under protective walls, then there is no incentive for that foreign investor to bring in the best technology, to produce the best goods, because he is, in any case, like your own industry, is also a protected industry. So if one of the objectives is to learn from the best practices, best technology that is available outside, this is not the way to go about it. So this is what I would like to say in response, that you need to perhaps rethink your economic strategy. It is certainly important for you to be able to get technology and capital from the best sources that are available. If you look at economic history, you will see this pattern, that there are existing centers of the highest knowledge, highest technology. Others aspire to become the same. You go through a certain kind of a trajectory. The first stage is of adoption of technology, of high knowledge. The second stage is of assimilation, where you try to internalize what you have learned. And it's only in the third stage that you become a generator of knowledge, that you become the creator of new technologies. But you have to go through that. There is no way that you can jump, immediately to the third phase. So India is also in that phase today, that you have to learn, you have to adopt, you have to, assimilate. And the more you are able to do that, the better your future is going to be. So take the example of China. China, in a sense, over the last 40 years has been like a giant sponge, this is what I call it, where it has been absorbing knowledge and technology from wherever it can get it. Beg, borrow, steal, but, really like, it's really like a sponge. That is what has brought it to a point where today, even in some very, very cutting edge technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, it is proving to be a competitor for even the United States. So we should learn from that experience.
This is where I would come to this question, that we are talking about India, we're talking about US, we're talking about China. But in the earlier bipolar world, the bipolar was Russia. And India has been a traditional friend of Russia, if one can say so. I think post-Gorbachev that has been diluted. So how do you see India's relationship with Russia? Because Russia has a great mineral resource. We still need those commodities as much as we can rely on China. So how do you see that relationship going forward?
Without any way devaluing the India-Russia relationship, I think we need to accept that India-Russia relations are not what they were during the Indo-Soviet period. That phase is over, that is gone. And we should also accept that the one glue which held India and the then Soviet Union together from 1960 to 1990 till the end of the Cold War was the common sense of threat from China. That was a key factor. Now that glue is no longer there. Just as it has become a glue for India in the US, that glue in that relationship is gone. So essentially what you are doing today is to handle the legacy issues with regard to the old Indo-Soviet relationship, where, for example, the defense part was very important. So, when there are several, Soviet or Russian platforms which we have, typically you would change them only in 30 years, 40 years. I mean, that is how long these systems go. So whether you like it or not, you have to be able to keep those platforms in good repair, properly maintained. And in addition, it is true, there are some areas of high technology, like for example, nuclear submarines, where Russia continues to be the only source from which we are able to access such technology. And therefore, there continues to be an interest in India to at least maintain in some key areas, maintain that kind of a strategic relationship. And I suspect that for some time, this will continue. But there is no doubt that the nature of the relationship has changed. Today, thanks to the hostility that Russia is facing from the United States of America, what it is facing from Western Europe, although Western Europe is a little more nuanced in its opposition to Russia, it sees no alternative but to, in fact, have some kind of a understanding, a stronger relationship with China. Now, I still believe that China's and Russia's long-term interests are not aligned. Why do I say that? I say that because if you look at Russian interests, its near neighborhood is Eastern Europe, its near neighborhood is Central Asia. These are two areas which are critically important to Russia. And as you have seen with Crimea, Russia is prepared to go to war in order to protect its interests in this, what it regards as its strategic space, very important for it. Now, in that context, the country which is expanding its influence the fastest in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, is China. So now, Russian disquiet about this is muted because of the larger issue that I spoke about, because of the hostility of the US and Western Europe. But that doesn't mean that it does not have some anxiety about what is happening in its own neighborhood. The other question is the nuclear issue. Now, so far, essentially the two leading nuclear powers were United States and Russia. Their arsenals, technology far ahead of others, including China. But in the last 10 to 15 years, China's nuclear deterrent not only has been expanding, but it is becoming more and more sophisticated. So now, even Russia is open to the idea that if there have to be negotiations on nuclear arms control, China should participate in that, which China does not want to. Of course, it doesn't want any constraints on its nuclear arsenal. There are issues of that kind which are current in the relationship between India and Russia. And I think the calculation on the Indian side is that we should be mindful of these issues which are inherent in the relationship. And therefore, we should not come to the conclusion that Russia is now irredeemably gone to the Chinese side. It makes sense for India to keep that little space open for itself, even if on the economic side, on the trade side, not much has been happening, because yes, Russia is finding China a much bigger market, a much bigger purchaser of its energy resources and other minerals that it has, rather than India, which is somewhat far.
Shanta Sinha, our friend, is asking a question. What are the elements of continuity and change in foreign policy when compared to the previous UPA regime? Are there any significant differences in the policy?
I'll just add one question to that, sir.
Yes, please.
The current foreign policy is also driven by corporate interest.
Okay. So with respect to the question on continuity, there has to be continuity. Every government wants to be seen as making a major departure in foreign policy. But foreign policy at the end of the day is determined by your the level of power that you have, the neighborhood in which you are situated, in the kind of economic relationships that you have. It is influenced by history, by culture, the temperament of the people. So I would say that while every government tries to suggest that it is making a major departure, sooner or later you find that it starts coming back to some kind of a norm trend, as it were. And so I don't see the Modi government actually making a major change in that respect. To give you an example, we talked about the nuclear deal between India and the United States. Now, for the time when BJP was not in power, it was very critical of this nuclear deal, saying that selling off India's interests and criticizing the Congress. And yet, when Mr. Modi came to power, not only in terms of the relationship with the United States, many people had thought that because of the whole denial of visa issue, there will be this rancor and perhaps India-US relations will suffer as a result. It did not. In fact, the most significant expansion in India-US relations has taken place under Mr. Modi. Therefore, he has not only continued the earlier policy, but has in fact reinforced. Similarly, if you look at the nuclear issue, that he is the one who managed to overcome some of the legacy issues with regard to, for example, the whole aspect of liability insurance with regard to nuclear issues. I don't see much change, even with respect to Pakistan. After all, in the early stages, he reached out to Nawaz Sharif, tried his level best to try and, establish a more friendly relationship. I don't blame him for that not working out. Having said that, the fear that I have is that for this government, uh, sometimes domestic political compulsions undermine foreign policy interests. So I, for example, was very disturbed that one of the great success stories of Indian foreign policy, in which the Modi government played a very important role, which is India-Bangladesh partnership. I think we should recognize that this has been a very good example of how you should be actually running neighborhood policy. Uh, you could do more, but certainly in the limitations it was. Now, as part and parcel of the domestic political, bargaining and jostling, you have references to migrants coming in as termites or throwing people out, or with respect to, say, Pakistan. If you have a domestic political situation in which you start using Pakistan as a factor in domestic politics, then it becomes very difficult to actually try and have any kind of a proper foreign policy or for that country. So essential continuity I see, because it is driven by India's interests. No government is able to actually move away from that, even if it wants to. But I do feel that this tendency to bring foreign policy into the domestic political space, it has happened before also. I'm not saying that only this government is doing it, but that is always, from the point of view of a professional, I would say, that is always a very dicey kind of a thing to do. It constrains your ability to really have a more flexible kind of a foreign policy. So in that sense, again, I'm somewhat relieved that in the current elections, campaigns that are taking place with regard to Bengal and several others, even though these are very, very, shall I say, fierce kind of election, contests that are taking place. The political leadership seems to have decided not to play up the Pakistan factor so much, not to play up the Bangladesh factor so much, even in Bengal and Assam. I would have expected that would happen, but I'm very relieved that it has not.
So we have to close, but I'm tempted to ask one last question.
Yes,
because this conversation is so engaging. The question is, then do you say that can career diplomats make good ministers?
In fact, I was going to close this session by a message that I got from a friend of mine, saying that Mr. Shyam Saran should be our our foreign minister.
Well, I'm very, very thankful for this appreciation that you are expressing. But I mean, obviously, having somebody professional as the minister has its advantages, because here you have somebody in place who understands foreign policy issues, who has had experience in dealing with countries and understands the nuances in terms of foreign policy. So that could be a certain advantage. But the disadvantage could be, I don't know whether it is a disadvantage, could be that the professional core of the foreign ministry perhaps does not then have as much leeway, as much space to really contribute to policy making. Because, if you have somebody who's a top professional already in that space, then what is the role of the, say, the foreign secretary or the role of the professional diplomatic corps of the country. So there could be some disadvantage like that. But there are several countries which follow this pattern of, in fact, appointing the top person in the foreign ministry, a civil servant in the foreign ministry, as a minister. Mr. Lavrov, for example, in Russia is a good example of that. Or China follows that example too. Even Indonesia, usually it is the person who has headed the foreign ministry who then becomes the foreign minister. So it is a pattern which a number of countries follow. But here, I think it should be fair to say that the Prime Minister has, over the years, had a lot of interaction with Jaishankar in his capacity as ambassador in China, ambassador in the US, and therefore has a lot of regard for him and a lot of trust in him, and that is why I suppose he has become the foreign minister.